The main character had a scary dream in which he approached some ruins, but suddenly a large fiery eye rose from the ashes. Seeing it, he was horrified. Then the main character woke up. He did not understand what it could be, because this was not the first time he had dreamed. The main character's name is Lee Sin. This year he turned 19 and now he is in the Bindya Federation. The Federation is near the Xia state, closer to the northern part, although there is a certain language barrier there, but the pay for hard work is high. 2 years ago his father accidentally fell out of a window while working on a construction site and was severely injured. When the family rushed to the hospital, they were told that it was impossible to save the father and the father died. Because there was no license, the construction company refused to pay damages, and then the company manager paid 50,000 from his own pocket to quickly solve the problem. The protagonist was not satisfied with this, but he had no other choice. The construction job is very hard, but it pays a lot of money. After his father died, all responsibility for the family was on the protagonist. He promised never to give up and make sure that the family would not need anything. But after working at the construction site not very long, Lee went to hospital because of unsuitable conditions. While sitting in his room, Lee saw a beautiful girl get out of the car, and suddenly seeing her, Lee thought Bindya girl's figure was great. Unexpectedly Uncle Yu came up to Lee and said that the boss came to visit them and brought fruit. After a while they looked out the window and Lee told Uncle to relax and just rest, because the boss told them that he would cover all medical expenses and would pay minimum wage. Lee asked Uncle when he would be discharged. Uncle Yu replied that he had told the boss that his shoulder still hurt and the boss allowed him to be treated for a few more days. Lunch was brought to them, but Lee didn't want to eat, because all he had been doing was eating and sleeping, and he had been feeling strange weakness. In the deep night someone was brought to their hospital. Strange noises woke Lee and wondered if more patients had been brought at this time. Doctors went into the room where Lee and Uncle Yu were lying and they turned on the light and dragged Uncle Yu somewhere. Lee wanted to stop them and find out what they were doing, but for some unknown reason he couldn't move or say anything. Lee thought it was just a bad dream and went back to sleep. Next morning Lee woke up with a severe headache. He looked at Uncle Yu's bed but no one was there. He was terrified because what he saw yesterday was no dream. Lee ran out of the room and asked the nurse where the man who was in the same room as him. She told him that the patient was discharged early this morning. But Lee couldn't believe it, because yesterday Uncle Yu said that he would be in the hospital for a few more days. Suddenly a wounded man was wheeled in front of him on a couch. Seeing that, Lee was scared because the patient was in terrible condition and his wounds looked like gunshots. Lee thought, if this patient has gunshot wounds, that surely means it has something to do with the police. A police officer approached Lee and told him to go back to his room and to stay out of the way in the hallway. He wanted to go back into the room, but suddenly he saw a security camera and on the other side was a janitor and he had a tattoo on his arm. He locked himself in his room and was horrified and assumed that this was a hospital for criminals. Lee decided to call his boss. He told him that Uncle Yu had been discharged from the hospital and asked him if Uncle Yu had returned to the construction site. The boss replied that Uncle Yu had been discharged early in the morning. He called him. Lee was relieved and happy about it. He told the boss that he would soon be discharged from hospital too and return to work. But at that moment the boss smirked evilly and told Lee not to hurry and rest for a few more days, but Lee replied that he was young and recovering very quickly, plus his family had great difficulties. The boss nervously smoked and said he would pick him up tomorrow. Then the boss nervously hung up the phone and called Lee a treacherous pig. He called Mr. Ding Ku and said that their plan had to be rescheduled urgently, saying, right, it was all him. Lee was glad that he was checking out tomorrow, but still he did not realize whether it was a dream that he had seen last night. Besides, Lee noticed that he slept so soundly as if he was on medication. But suddenly Lee got up in a stupor, because he has constant insomnia and disorder of the day, but after he came here, he is tired all the time and wants to sleep. He thought, have I been stuffed with all sorts of nasty stuff? After a while it was lunch time. Lee decided not to eat that food, because there might be medicine in them. Then he opened Uncle Yu's refrigerator and there was fruit. He realized that in no way should anyone know about it. Deep in the night Lee also skipped dinner, because he made sure that there really was some problem with food. He heard someone's footsteps and pretended to be asleep. Doctors came into his room and grabbed him. Lee did not understand where they were taking him, and these two doctors took Uncle Yu away yesterday. They were standing near the elevator and Lee saw the doctor press the B1 level, which was the parking lot. Lee was terrified and tried to pretend he was asleep and then pick an opportunity and escape from here. But once the elevator they came to B1 level, Lee saw that it was not a parking lot. He was shocked and did not understand where they were taking him. The doctors took him to some strange room and then they left. Lee saw that there was no one else in this room but him. He got up and tried to open the door, but the doctors had locked the door from the back. He was very scared and tried to find any way to get out of here, but after a while he found some door that was not locked. There was a lot of different documentation in this room. He went in hoping to find the exit or at least find the keys. But unexpectedly he hit a folder of documents. Several documents fell on the floor. Lee saw that one folder belonged to Uncle Yu. Opening it he was shocked as it said that all Uncle Yu's organs had been removed. Suddenly Lee heard someone enter the main room. He was very scared. Two doctors entered the room. He asked the assistant if all the instruments were ready. She said they were ready and called him Mr. Cooley. He told her, "Alice, what should you call me when we are two of us?" She replied, "Yes, master." But suddenly someone hit her from behind. Dr. Cooley didn't understand what happened, and when he turned away Lee jumped him with a chair and hit him with all his might. Lee took the 4 tube and walked over to the girl. He touched her and got a woman's blood on his hand. He wanted to taste it, but suddenly he stopped himself and didn't understand why he wanted to do it. But now was not the best time to think about it. He tied the girl's hands and also took Dr. Cooley and took away their keys and cards to open the doors, but suddenly he stopped and decided to ask the doctor for some information. Lee splashed a bucket of water on him and the doctor woke up. Lee told him to tell him what was going on here, but the doctor said he'd better let him go. Lee showed him Uncle Yu's picture, but the doctor said he didn't know anything. At which point Lee stabbed him with a big shot. He exclaimed to the doctor, "If he doesn't know what's going on here he will stay here forever," but the doctor was in a lot of pain. He said he would tell him everything, but only on the condition that he wouldn't hurt him anymore. Lee told him if he would answer all questions honestly then he wouldn't touch him. The doctor said that the guy in the picture was already dead, and his usable organs had already been taken away, and they had kept them here so long to find a buyer willing to pay a good sum. Lee was shocked by this information, because to them Uncle Yu and other people are all the same animals, no more than commodities to make money. If Lee hadn't realized then, he would have been killed by these people now too. Lee wanted to hit the doctor with all his might, but at the last moment, the doctor exclaimed, "You promised not to hit me if I tell everything." Lee stopped and asked where his car was and what his license plate number was. The doctor gave the license plate number and said his car was in the parking lot. But then Lee picked up a scalpel and killed the doctor. Lee saw that his assistant was alive and walked up to her. She begged him not to kill her because she was only 19 years old. He asked her where the other patients were, but she had a hard time talking about it. Lee realized that the other patients were dead too. Then he killed her. Lee changed into the doctor's clothes and said that creatures like them should have died. After a while Lee sneaked to the doctor's car unnoticed. He saw the guard standing near the parking lot exit. He wanted to get out of that hospital unnoticed as soon as possible. He lowered the sunshade so the guards couldn't see his face. But suddenly the guards exclaimed, "Dr. Cooley, you have a package." Lee thought if he stopped next to them they would know something was wrong, so he hit the gas and drove past them at high speed, hitting the package. The guards noticed that Dr. Cooley wasn't driving and tried to stop him. Lee saw the guards and some man in a suit running after him. He pulled out a gun and shot at Lee. It hit him right in the stomach. From the pain and shock he lost control and flew off the cliff, falling into the river. The water began to flood the car rapidly. Lee tried to open the door, but because of the high pressure the door would not open. He tried to break the window but it was unsuccessful. Lee was very upset and couldn't believe that he would die this way. After a while Lee woke up in a place he didn't know where he was. He thought, didn't I get shot? I even threw myself into the river with the car. He looked at his wound site but his stomach wound was gone. Lee thought he was dreaming. He went to the top to see what was going on. Climbing up the mountain he didn't understand what this place was, because there was nothing but rocks and it was quiet like a cemetery. Suddenly he heard someone crying. He rushed to see who it could be. As he walked around the rock he came across a huge flower. He couldn't believe that these sounds were made by the flower. He didn't notice the roots of the flower coming closer and closer to him. He decided to get closer to the flower and see what was inside it, but suddenly the flower opened up and the flower had a huge, scary mouth. The flower pounced on him and began to swiftly envelop Lee. He was shocked by this and didn't understand how this could happen. At that moment the flower bit him on the back. He tried to run away but his arms and legs were already gripped. He couldn't move. The flower almost completely engulfed the protagonist, but at the last moment he saw the silhouettes of his mother and sister. He wondered if he would die such a ridiculous death again. Lee exclaimed, "What will my family do if I die?" He was furious and wasn't going to give up. He began to devour the flower so he could have an outlet. In his anger he was able to free his arms and legs. Kvito released him but he continued to attack him, but Lee saw a small hole and began to pick at it. There he found the heart of the flower. He was furious and killed the flower. Lee had a big change in appearance. He was angry, but suddenly he started to lose consciousness. He didn't understand what happened. At that time the car in which Lee drowned was pulled from the bottom of the river. Whoever shot Lee was on the phone and said that the car was lifted up but the body inside was gone, but the wounds he sustained were so severe that according to preliminary estimates he would not survive. He was told, "I want to see him, if he is alive, or his corpse. If he is dead, keep looking." At this time Lee was thrown ashore. He again did not understand where he was, for the last thing he remembered was that he was fighting a huge flower. Lee lifted up his shirt. He saw that the bullet was still in his body, but the wound had healed. He didn't understand what the hell was going on. For a moment a system window appeared in front of him. He didn't know what it was. At that moment a car drove past him and in the window a little girl looked at him. The protagonist saw her but didn't pay any attention. Lee thought, even though I escaped from the hospital, it's still not safe there. I can't attract attention. Climbing up from the shore he saw that he was in the town of Sar. It wasn't that far from the construction site where Lee worked. He needed to get his things and passport. Late at night he came to the town of Jelu, where there was a construction site and a dormitory for construction workers. At this time everyone was at the construction site. Lee remembered that the foreman had taken his passport. It should be in his office. He tried to creep unnoticed, but suddenly in the boss's office he heard a conversation. The men in suits told the boss, "Yu Liang's money is gone, let's talk about another." Boss replied, "He killed our 2 members. If the case is not taken care of, you have any money at all, don't worry, I still have his passport, only I know where he is. If he is not dead, he will come back." Lee was shocked. He thought, when my father had an accident, I believed the foreman because he was helping us from his money. Suddenly, he is involved in organ trafficking. Could it be that not only Uncle Yu but my father's accident didn't happen either? Lee accidentally touched a glass bottle. Everyone in the room heard it and immediately ran to the window, but Lee managed to hide behind a corner. 2 hours later Lee went to the phone and called the boss. The boss didn't understand who it was. He said it was Lee. The boss asked in surprise, "Lee, what happened to you?" Lee answered, "Boss, there is something wrong with this hospital. I am hurt and can't go anywhere. You have to come and save me." The boss smiled evilly and asked, "Where is he now?" Lee named a street in the city of Sar. He asked the boss to come soon, because he was the only person he could trust. The boss hung up and called Yuz. He said, "Damn, Lee got caught. he said ask Lee to meet one of the streets in the city of Sar. The boss told him to come to him as soon. The boss went to the car with just about to open the door, but at that moment Lee came up to him and hit him in the head. The boss fell to the ground and Lee grabbed his leg and dragged him somewhere. The boss asked in fear what he was going to do, but Lee coldly replied that he would soon see for himself. After a while Lee arrived at some tunnel. He opened the trunk and pulled out his boss. He grabbed him by the leg and carried him deep into the tunnel. Suddenly Lee heard some strange noises. He thought that these noises were made by some beast. He didn't see a crying girl sitting in the distance. He threw a piece of earth at her and heard a human voice. Lee went closer and shined his flashlight. He thought, damn, it's a girl, I hit her. He saw the girl's hands and feet were tied. Lee thought, could it be kidnapping or imprisonment? Lee asked her if she was okay and if she understood him. She asked Lee, who are you? Did your brother send you to save Anna? Lee remembered this girl. He saw her when he had just come up from the beach, and she was knocking from the window of a passing car. Lee assumed that means this morning she was asking for help. Lee took out a scalpel and started to free her. He asked her if she knew where the man who kidnapped her and how long she had been here. She said she didn't know those people. There were two of them and they left her and quickly left. Lee noticed this girl was physically advanced beyond her years. Suddenly a mouse ran past her. He got scared and hugged him. Lee thought, it's just a mouse, but that little girl looks grown up. At that moment her eyes and look changed dramatically. She told him that her legs were numb. She asked him to carry her in his arms. Lee thought, you seriously think I'm a pervert? I've heard a lot about this kind of thing. I want to live long enough to be free. He handed her the phone and said she could call the police from this number, and that was all he could do. But the voice in her head told her how it went wrong. You can't let him go so easily. She grabbed him and said she was afraid of being alone and asked him to stay, but Lee told her he had important things to do. He said goodbye and left her. She couldn't understand why her plan didn't work with him. After a while the guys came to her and tied her up. They couldn't understand how she could get out. Suddenly her appearance changed a lot. She became very beautiful and feminine. She told them, walk around, I hope you too can satisfy me. She killed them and thought, strange why it didn't work on that guy. She called her brother and told him to come and get her. At this time Lee splashed water on the boss and told him to answer all questions honestly or else it would be worse. The boss said he didn't know what he was talking about and called Lee an accomplice to the crime. Lee kicked him in the face and the boss fell to the ground. The boss exclaimed, stop it, isn't what I said enough? Lee replied, you cooperated with St. Lawrence Hospital to do dirty and dark things there? Boss replied, yes, I was in charge of delivering the goods to the hospital. Lee asked what the goods meant and said, did my father really fall and die by accident? The boss replied, no, he didn't die because of that, but he was sent to the hospital to die. Lee said, can I believe your words? Boss replied in horror that he had no reason to lie if he already found out the whole truth. Lee asked where his passport and visa were. Boss said that Yice took it from the hospital and gave it to Boss Marcus. Lee said that he was going to kill him quickly, but that would be too easy. After a while Lee was back to the world where he killed that flower yesterday. He didn't understand what that world was and how he got here again. A system window appeared before him again, which only had 3 characteristics and no status or intelligence. He didn't understand if his body was real, or if it was just his soul and consciousness. Lee thought, either way, you can't see the monsters here in the real world. Just that fact would help protect himself. Suddenly he smelled a delicious smell. He couldn't believe that there was anyone else in this world but him, but he remembered to be extremely careful. But walking by the scent he saw that it was a flower that attracted its prey with its special scent, but this flower was not like the one he saw yesterday, plus this flower is stuck in the ground and can't move. Lee was hesitant to approach the flower, so he threw a rock at it. The flower sensed it, grabbed it and crushed the rock. Lee realized that this plant has no eyes. it just instinctively picks up moving objects around it, and can't tell the difference what is in front of it. He picked up a rock and said, "I can't kill you, I'll exhaust you," and started throwing rocks at the flower. But every rock was destroyed and that wasn't enough. Lee started throwing all the rocks lying next to it at the flower and eventually he almost succeeded. Lee took a huge boulder and threw it into the center of the flower's parallel, hitting it. After 10 minutes he managed to kill the flower, but suddenly a black mass flew out of the flower and Lee thought the flower was still alive. But the black mass soaked into it and Lee started to feel a surge of strength. The system informed him that his stats recovered, then he realized that the gunshot wound had healed overnight and suddenly his physical condition improved. Lee exclaimed joyfully, "Is this moving to another level like in a video game?" EE wanted to check how much strength he added. The structure of this flower is tough and hitting it is very easy. Suddenly he heard scary sounds behind him. He turned around and saw black clouds approaching him, in which red eyes could be seen. He wanted to look at them but suddenly Lee passed out again. After a while Lee woke up and thought, "Torture is so exhausting, I'm so tired I accidentally fell asleep, had to fight this monster in my dream. I used to get to this place once in a while but now I find myself there every day when I fall asleep." Lee decided to check his characteristics and they were slightly increased. Lee was confident that he could become stronger in reality if he pumped up in that world. He wanted to return his passport, then return home and call the police, because at St. Lawrence Hospital, because people from all over Xia State are cut there, but now that Lee could gain enough strength, he was going to blow up that creepy place himself. But along with strength, his appetite increased too. Lee began to think about finding money somewhere. At this moment, the news was on TV. The main topic was related to St. Lawrence Hospital. The main suspect is on the run. Sheriff Lan Sky assures that he will do everything possible to capture the criminal. Lee thought, still, the disgusting passport photo has its advantages. They cannot even find me, but even so, I cannot stay in place for long. My family has probably already heard about it, so we need to find a way to call them safely. We need to lay low for a couple of days. Food and water should be enough. Lee walked up to the car and saw someone sitting there eating his food. He exclaimed to him who he was, but the bandit told him not to yell and told him to give him the car keys and money. Lee walked up to him and the bandit wanted to stab him, but at the last moment Lu grabbed his hand and hit him with all his might in the face. The bandit fell unconscious. As it turned out, the bandit was dead. Lee looked at his hand because he didn't want to do that. Suddenly he felt an incredible sensation that hit his brain. He stood there terrified and couldn't believe he was enjoying it. He wondered if it could be that there were any side effects as his strength increased. Lee drove out of town and hid his body in the metal trash. He looked at it and apologized, then Lee drove away at high speed. After a while Lee was back in an unknown world, but this time he no longer saw the red eyes which were in smoke. Lee approached the past color and saw that he had nothing left. He assumed that the black shadows, attracted by the putrid smell of color, were gone after his death. He saw that there was a substance unfamiliar to him. Lee took it and was surprised that this substance was very aggressive. The shard of bone did not dissolve into the flower, so it was an unusual force. Lee tried hitting the stone with this bone and was greatly surprised, as the bone was perfectly sharp for a dagger. Lee noticed that there were a lot of bones in this area. This place was even more dangerous than he thought. Lee wandered around in his dreams all night but never realized anything. Suddenly he saw a black dust scar on his finger. This meant that wounds in dreams remain in reality. It was no longer safe in Gru Town. He needed to leave this town. Lee blew up the car and said it was time to find Marcus. He began to test and use his skills. He ran with great speed like lightning. And he also got a high jump. He was happy with these skills, but because he wasn't used to them he couldn't control them properly. Then he ran into a tree. He needed to learn his new self better. Then he went to town. In town he saw a little boy being beaten up by a big man. He grabbed the boy and demanded money from him. threatening to break his legs, but the boy had no money at all. He wanted to hit the boy, but Lee managed to stop him in time. Lee told him, how dare he threaten his countrymen. Lee easily dismissed him and tried to talk to the boy, but as it turned out he spoke Chinese, but as it turned out he also knew other languages and thanked Lee for his help. Suddenly the bandit jumped on Lee with a trash can, but he stopped him without any problem and shoved him into the bucket himself. The boy told Lee that he had helped him a lot and asked him maybe to pay him back. Lee replied to him, "Can you just feed me if you don't mind?" Then they went to a restaurant and Lee set a whole table of delicious and appetizing food. The boy said that Lee could eat as much as he wanted because it was his family's restaurant. Lee realized that he had saved the child of a rich family. 30 minutes later the table was already empty and Lee thanked his parents for their hospitality. The boy's parents were surprised because just now Lee had eaten food for 10 people. The boy's mom asked Lee if he had any problems, and if he did, they would be happy to help. Lee could not pass up this chance. He told them his name and said that he lost his visa and asked them if they had any work for him. The boy's dad answered him, "You saved Chi, so I think you can be trusted. You can stay and work in my restaurant. Food and accommodation we will provide you, and we will give you a salary separately." Lee thanked them for this opportunity. Chi was happy about it and said that he wanted to live together with Lee. At night Lee lay on his bed. He thought Uncle Wooey was so kind. Not only did he shelter me, but he also gave me a phone. First of all, I need to call my mom and tell her I'm okay. Lee called his mom. She asked if he was okay as she had heard he was in some trouble with the police in Bindia, and they were looking for him. She asked what happened to him. Lee said he was fine, just had a little misunderstanding and would be home soon. He asked her not to worry as he had earned enough money and he would give it to her when he returned. He went to an unknown world and started to fight all the flowers that came his way. Raise his level. Pretty soon the flowers were no longer a threat to him. And to get stronger, Lee needs to fight more dangerous monsters. Lee spent all night on shift and didn't meet anyone, so he could try to look for prey. His brother Chi came to him and gave him a dictionary so he could learn the language, and said that if he couldn't handle it, he would be happy to help him when he got home from school. As time went by, Lee realized that not only her body but her memory got much better. He could remember all the words and phrases by reading them once. Uncle Wooey came up to him and said it was time to test his language skills, and told him to go to the store and buy groceries. The store was on the outskirts, near the intersection. On the way Lee decided to check if the guy was alive. When he arrived at that place he noticed that there was no one there, and there was only an untied rope. He was about to leave, but as it turned out it was an ambush. One of them asked if it was him. Another replied that all Chinese look alike, and told him to take him to his boss. They all mobbed up on Lee, but Lee was only happy to do so and exclaimed to them that they were not Marcus men. He told them that he himself did not mind seeing him. Lee ruthlessly started beating everyone who got in his way. They were shocked and really scared as they couldn't imagine he would be that strong. Lee told them to tell them immediately where Marcus was, but none of them told him. Suddenly Lee grabbed one by the face and told him, "I don't think you want to see your brains coming out of your ears, right?" He was really scared and said he would tell everything. Lee let him go and said, "Does he know what will happen to him if he lies?" He answered that Marcus was in Yangbu, but he didn't know where exactly. His man Ursus found them and said he would pay if they found the Chinese man. Lee took the leaf from his hands and kicked him in the face. Lee didn't understand why. He was feeling very hungry and thirsty. But he thought there was no time to think about it, as he had to take Marcus out. After a while Lee thought, the man in charge of the transnational group who is actually in charge of the smuggling trade in Yangbu, such a person must be surrounded by a bunch of people. Need to find out more about him. At this point his brother Chi came to him. Lee told him that he was late. Chi replied that he overslept and he had to run urgently. Lee noticed that Chi was kind of strange today. At night, Lee continued to fight monsters in a world unknown to him. He decided to check his characteristics. His strength and build was almost 2, but Li noticed that he was getting less and less experience. The region of bone debris is huge, the location of flowers is also extensive, so it is very rare. Suddenly he was attacked by a formidable and huge wolf. Li was happy about it and said that he had waited a long time for him. He had to suffer to know how strong it will be after it defeated him. Li kicked it in the head with his knee, and tried to plunge his blade into its head, but the wolf was too strong, and Li failed. At that moment the wolf scratched Li's stomach hard. Li recoiled from it. He was impressed by its strength. But Li was not going to give up. He noticed that when the wolf attacked it only moved straight. He decided to take advantage of this. The moment the wolf attacked him again, Li dodged and kicked the wolf on the stomach with all his might. The wolf flew away a few meters and Li pounced on it with his blade. He managed to pierce its neck and thus succeeded in overcoming it. Then Li checked his characteristics. He was tired but happy when he saw that his stats finally reached 2. Suddenly he felt a strong more in his right arm. He looked at his arm and was shocked. Black elements started to appear on his arm. He didn't understand what was happening to him. Black elements started to take over his whole body. It started to transform. Li was terrified and thought he was turning into a monster. Li tried to stop it in some way but he couldn't do it. His mind was out of control and demanding blood, but he tried to stop himself and screamed that he didn't need anything. He grabbed his chest and tried to remove the monster elements from his body, but it was useless as the wounds he was inflicting on himself were healing with incredible speed. But after a while the monster took over his body. Li started to lose consciousness and said that he was human, not a monster. At the end he saw, now his nickname was, the Void Root. At this time his uncle and aunt tried to wake him up. He woke up and yelled at them not to come near him. He looked at his body and thought, body is not changed, I got over. Li took the blanket away and his uncle asked him what happened. Li replied that he had a nightmare. He told them he would get up now and go to the store, but his uncle said there was no need to go anywhere and suggested he rest today. Li thanked his uncle for his understanding. Li thought if he turned into a monster, he could forget about revenge because he would get arrested and be experimented on. After each energy absorption his bloodlust gets stronger. Li said safety is more important and you can't blindly seek power. After a while Li came to a nightclub. Behind the bar sat a beautiful girl. The bartender asked her what she wanted. She pointed her finger at Li, said she wanted him. She hugged Li and said she would wait for him in room number 3, Sector A, and slipped money into his pocket saying it was bail. The bartender said he was lucky. Li replied he needed to buy something from Tony. The bartender replied, "You look good." Tony would never, but at this point Li interrupted him and told him not to jump to conclusions. Li handed him a wad of money and the bartender said Tony was in Sector B, in room number 12. At this time Tony was talking to a girl. She asked him not to touch her, but at that moment Li came to the door and said, "Hello, your order is delivered." Tony was furious and exclaimed, "Why didn't you come earlier?" He grabbed the door handle, but at that moment Li kicked the door with all his might. Tony flew to the other end of the room and asked in surprise, who was he? But Li told him to shut up and answer the questions he was about to ask him. It turned out that Jews had put a black bounty on Dawes. Li planned to capture them alive and get a big reward. This group of people had seen the reward and wanted to make lots of money, but they didn't get along with Marcus at all. But if Li gets access to the subway, he will find Marcus sooner or later. Li left the club and he got a call from Uncle Wooey. He said Chi is not back from school yet and he went to look for him. Li replied that he was on his way too. Li thought, "I heard Chi's brother joined the fight club. Aren't you in school with that bully Yogi?" This time Chi was sparring against Yogi. He hit him and Chi fell. Chi asked him not to hit him anymore, but Yogi said he was his sparring partner and now they are training. Li walked into the fight club and exclaimed that Yogi is looking for the weak in sparring, and it seems that the so-called fight club is actually a hooligan club. One of the athletes replied to him, "I think you're looking for death, since you dared to come to the fight club, but at that moment Yogi said, "Relax men, this guy is my enemy, I'll deal with him myself." Yogi swung at Lee and exclaimed to him that he was too weak to say anything, but Lee effortlessly stopped him with one hand. He asked Lee in fear how he did it, but Lee just told him that he had nothing to prove to the stupid bear, and at that moment he broke his arm. Yogi got down on his knee and screamed in pain, but Lee didn't care about him and just kicked him. Suddenly he was being attacked from behind, but Lee sensed it and set his hand up and then he kicked him in the face. Lee had no problem handling all the athletes, they flew away from him one by one. In time Sister Monica came in, he told everyone to disperse, she jumped on Lee and wanted to hit him in the head. But Lee had time to react, he grabbed her leg and told her she had good legs and Lee threw her, but she was able to control the fall, she fell on her hands and bounced away from him. Monica looked at him and thought, this guy definitely has skills, that means she had to try her best. She didn't want to give up without a fight and started attacking him again. Lee told her that she's pretty fast, but in his eyes she's so small, and at that point he punched her in the stomach. She grabbed her stomach and exclaimed to him, "Damn, you have the advantage and you insult me for being short." She wanted to attack him again, but suddenly President Fuchi stopped her. Fuchi said, "Let me see how strong he is." Lee and Fuchi met their eyes in anticipation of an incredible fight. Suddenly Fuchi went into a rage and his body began to change a lot. Lee wondered and asked, "What is wrong with this guy?" Fuchi swung at him with great speed, but Lee put his fist up. Lee noticed that Fuchi's skin was changing color and his flesh and bones were too hard for a man. Fuchi said, "Look Monica, I'm trying my best and you want me to let you pass against him?" Lee wondered why he didn't fight anymore, he wondered what family this man was from. Fuchi turned to everyone in the room, he said Lee was holding back in his fights with all of them. Fuchi asked him, "I'm right, right?" Lee replied, "I'm only here to get my little brother, not to beat everyone up." He answered him, "I'll take care of it, scumbags who bully the weak don't deserve to stay in the fight club." Fuchi asked, "Will your little brother be my protection?" Lee asked, "What are the terms?" Fuchi said, "We'll talk about it somewhere else." Lee agreed with him. Lee told little brother Chi to go to school class and wait for him. Lee went into the office. Fuchi told him, "If he has something to say, just let him talk." Fuchi answered him, "I know you, you lucky guy from Luan Hospital Street." Lee looked at him furiously and asked, "Who the hell are you?" Fuchi said, "Calm down, I have no bad intentions, because I am a member of the Scorpion Society. Scorpions are Marcus' worst enemies in Timpu City." Lee exclaimed, "Tony mentioned scorpions before he died, and they are just as bad as Marcus. You want to hire me to fight Marcus?" Fuchi replied, "No, I just want to work with you to make money. I will be your manager if you go into the dungeon. This is the biggest underground event in Timpu, which involves almost all underground forces. If you go in, not only will you make money, but you will also get revenge." Lee replied, "Are you suggesting to kill Marcus and make him lose money and people?" Fuchi exclaimed, "Clever girl, I'll give you an identity, a place to live and practice, whatever, working with me is in your best interest." Lee was about to leave and said he would think about it and come back to him with an answer in the morning, but before he left Lee asked him a question, "Are you really a high school student?" Fuchi cheerfully replied, "I just turned 18 this year." After a while Lee and brother Chi were about to go home. Chi was delighted with the way Lee took down some fighters from the club, but Lee asked not to tell his grandparents. They got home and the table was full of delicious food. Lee and everyone else enjoyed their meal, and all of a sudden Lee told them that he was leaving because he didn't have a passport now, and if he stayed here they would be in trouble. His aunt wanted to stop him, but Uncle Wui told her that they should respect the decision that Lee made. After dinner Grandma started to cut Lee's hair, because in their hometown when a child leaves, the older ones cut his hair and fix his face so he can go out into the world with dignity. His aunt asked him to take care of himself and told him to come see them when he had time. After she cut his hair, he left. His aunt couldn't look at it and cried. His uncle asked Lee to be careful. Lee got into a cab and cried. The cabbie asked him where he was going. Lee told him to take him to Hara Street. He arrived at the nightclub and looked around carefully. He noticed that the club had 4 main doors, along with 6 in the back, only 10 guards. Lee thought if he acted fast he could solve them. Suddenly a girl came up to him and said, "Little brother, aren't you bored drinking alone?" But he rudely told her not to bother him. But she hugged him and said, "Don't be so cold, maybe we can do something else." But Lee told her to get off him. She told him, "I'm afraid you have to come with me." And at that moment a gun was pointed at Lee's head. The girl told him, "Stranger, you are not here for fun, are you? Come and tell me what you do here." But Lee was not going to obey her. He grabbed the guard's hand and pointed his gun at his own face. The girl was not expecting that and stood in a stupor. Everyone inside started to panic, and the guard radioed that something was happening at table 9. Lee told her, "You are right, I am here to kill someone." The guard started shooting at them unemployed, but Lee jumped in and grabbed her, told her to watch out for the manager. She told him to let her go because this is Mr. Marcus' territory and he can't leave here and Marcus will make his life hell. But he didn't care, he knocked her out and moved on. Lee jumped and started shooting at the disco ball to turn off the lights in the whole club. One of the guards said this kid was really slick. He asked what will they do now. The guards turned on their flashlights. The other guards said they knew the place better than he did. He told the guards outside to cover the front and back door and told the others to follow him to catch him. Lee accidentally hit the bottle in the dark. The bottle rolled and the guards immediately reacted and started shooting in that direction. Then they shined a flashlight and thought it was a trick. The guards exclaimed to him, "Be a good boy and maybe I'll do a merciful death for you." Lee was hurt and thought, looks like no one will be left alive today. He ran past the guards, but they spotted him and started shooting at him, but Lee had already run away and killed the guards who were behind them. They tried to track him down for a long time, shot but could never catch him. The moment they reloaded, Lee waited a moment and started hitting them. Despite his injury he handled the guards with no problem. The other guards were frightened, exclaimed, "This guy, is he a ghost?" Because no matter where they looked, they couldn't find Lee. They exclaimed, "Was there anyone else besides them alive?" Lee had already gone up to the 2nd floor and started shooting at the guards from there. Eventually one guard was left. He cowered in a corner in terror. He didn't scream and ask for help, he cried, but the radio told him, "You are so noisy, you must be the only one, right?" Lee said, "Marcus, the game is officially on. Such bad luck, I got shot by a stray bullet." Lee couldn't keep being there anymore as he needed to stop the blood. He doused everything with gasoline and alcohol and set the place on fire. He went to the hotel and sneaked into the room that had people in it. He tied them up and Lee went to the shower to get the bullet out. He was in a lot of pain, but it had to be done. After he got out of the shower he told them not to say anything to anyone as he would be leaving soon. Lee lay down on his bed and looked at his characteristics. They had not changed, but however his status was rapid flesh mutation. He did not understand what that meant. Lee wondered, was he turning into a monster? He couldn't do anything about it, as he didn't know what it was or how to prevent it. Then Lee went to bed. At that time, investigators arrived at the crime scene, at the burnt-out club, but the investigator didn't care and wanted to go home quickly. A girl investigator came up to him and said that witnesses were interviewed, and based on their words we can assume that there was a Chinese man who, but at this point the sergeant interrupted her and told her that it was just an accident and told her to close the case. But she grudgingly exclaimed to him that it couldn't have been an accident because the burned people had bullet wounds. She thought, again he is trying to close such a high-profile case, what are they hiding? And this Chinaman, who is he? This time Marcus Aide called the sergeant who closed the case and thanked him for his excellent work. The surviving security guard from the burned-out club came to him. Marcus Aid asked him why he was still alive. He replied that he pretended to be dead just to report and come back to them. The assistant said to tell the public that it was an accident and to tell witnesses to be quiet. He ordered his men to find that Chinese man. Suddenly they grabbed the surviving guard and threw him into the crocodile pool. At this time Lee was in an unknown world and trying to improve his skills, but after killing 7 flower monsters, his stats didn't improve at all. He also noticed that a mark appeared on his forehead. Attributes appeared in the stats, and mutation status. Lee realized that the root of nothingness meant that he was officially rooted in the dream world. In the system he saw that a green armor appeared. He saw it for the first time and decided to check what it was. Clicking on it he started to turn into a monster again, but he didn't want that and screamed for it all to stop, and suddenly the green armor disappeared from his body. After a while Lee realized it was a great ability, thus he was one step closer to becoming a superhero. A wolf came up to him, which he had trouble dealing with the last time, but Lee decided not to back down and test what his new green armor could do. The wolf pounced on him. Lee swung his arm and was about to jab the wolf in the jaw, but suddenly his arm and his body began to glow blue, and the moment the wolf almost bit him, Lee woke up and returned to the real world. Lee thought, is this the signal to come back to reality? He was about to leave, but before leaving he decided to check the characteristics. Lee thought, attributes and abilities don't appear, which means they can only be used in the dream world. Mutation speed has increased. Is it because of another enhancement? Whatever it is, I can't use it blindly. Lee went to the hall. Fuchi was waiting for him there. He told him that he had already heard about the noise he made last night. Fuchi asked, but why are you acting like nothing happened? Lee laughed in response and thanked for the information, but Fuchi was no laughing matter as Marcus knew that the fire in his nightclub and the murder was Lee's doing, and now Marcus knows his real identity. Lee said, so my importance is up again. How big is the reward this time? Lee looked into Fuchi's eyes and said, are you scared? Then forget the cooperation, I do not want to involve you. But Fuchi stopped him and said, seriously, you are not afraid, why should I be afraid? Fuchi said, ticket sales for underground fights are very limited and mostly put on gambling, and you only need to do 2 things, fight and leave the arena with the money. Every game has different odds and many different stakes. Lee answered him, I am a beginner, will seem miserable in the beginning to increase the odds, and then win at the last moment. I understand that I play for the pig to eat the tiger, so you can win big money. Fuchi answered him, I contribute money, you make efforts, it's a win-win cooperation, don't worry about the budget, I'm not the kind of person who plays on small bets. Lee answered Fuchi, I trust you. Then Lee asked if Fuchi can arrange him for money, a fake fight. But Fuchi told him that he's never done a fake fight and he's not proud of it. He said, but don't worry, I understand you, I won't make you do anything you don't like. Lee asked him, by the way, under Marcus there's a guy called the Bloody Hand, I heard he's very good. Fuchi answered in awe, he is more than good, the Bloody Hand Electra, the current king of Timpu, why, can't you stop thinking about him? Lee asked, wouldn't eliminating him be like chopping off Marcus' leg? Fuchi said, in terms of your strength you may be in the top 5, but from the Electra, I advise you to give up, you are not his equal. Suddenly Monica threw a bottle of water at Lee and said, no self-respect, you think you are invincible? You think there will be no consequences? Fuchi said, right, my sister Monica is right. Lee asked in surprise, what, Monica is your sister? Fuchi replied, yes, but she won't let me call her that in public. Fuchi said she and Monica are half-brother and sister. Marcus declared a hunt for Lee. Fuchi told him that he could leave it at this hotel since it is Scorpion property and Marcus men wouldn't dare enter here. Now Lee is under Fuchi's protection and he will take care of his sustenance and lodging. Fuchi told him that his life now depended on Lee. Lee asked, then why don't you teach me martial arts? suddenly Fuchi hit him but Lee managed to dodge. Fuchi said he had a keen eye. He said he would teach him 14 basic stances and told him to repeat after him, so he didn't need to watch his breathing. Fuchi noticed that Lee was learning the techniques having seen them only once. Lee's movements seemed simple, yet sprawling. His body was getting hotter, it looked like he was in an oven. Lee was incredibly difficult and at one point he realized that this was his limit, but suddenly he felt light in his body. He didn't understand what was happening to him. The system notified him that he had reached the first level in martial arts. As a consequence, chi and blood transfer began. Lee didn't know that the system could include updates from reality, but he had the feeling that nothing had changed. He decided to test it in martial arts. Then he felt the new chi and blood transfer function. With it, Lee could gather the scattered body strength into one point. It makes the arm and leg blows more powerful,